Officer Caleb Hayes leaned against his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee as he watched the quiet streets of Ridgewood. It was one of those humid summer evenings where the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on everything. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple in the sky. For a moment, the world seemed calm, but then out of nowhere, a boy came sprinting toward him. Caleb straightened up immediately, setting his coffee cup on the hood of the car. Something about the way the boy ran caught his attention. His movements were frantic, unsteady, like he was running for his life. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with wide, frightened eyes and tears streaming down his face. His clothes were dirty and his sneakers slapped against the pavement with every desperate step. Caleb stepped forward, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. Hey, slow down," he said gently. "What's going on?" The boy didn't stop until he reached Caleb, nearly crashing into him. He grabbed onto the officer's uniform with both hands, his small fingers trembling. "Please," the boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You have to help me." Caleb knelt down so he could look the boy in the eye. "Okay, buddy, I'm here. What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy choked out between sobs. "My name is Marcus." "All right, Marcus, take a deep breath. Tell me what happened." For a few seconds, Marcus just stood there, shaking. Then, in a voice so low Caleb almost missed it, he whispered, "She's not my real mom." Caleb frowned. "Who's not your real mom, Marcus? Can you tell me who she is?" Marcus hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear. When he spoke again, his words came out in a rush. "Patricia. She says she's my mom, but she's not. She took me. And now she's doing things to me. Bad things. I don't know what to do." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He'd dealt with plenty of cases involving missing or abused children, but there was something different about this one. Maybe it was the raw fear in Marcus's voice, or the way the boy kept looking around like he was being hunted. Whatever it was, Caleb knew he needed to act fast. "Okay, Marcus," he said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're going to figure this out together. Do you know where you live? Where Patricia lives?" Marcus nodded quickly. Yes, I can show you. It's not far from here, just a few blocks away." "All right." Caleb pulled out his radio and called dispatch. "This is Officer Hayes. I need backup at 42 Elm Street. Possible child endangerment situation. Send a unit as soon as possible." As they waited for backup, Caleb tried to get more information from Marcus. "How long have you lived with Patricia?" he asked carefully. "I don't know," Marcus replied, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "It feels like forever. She adopted me, but I don't think it was legal. I remember being somewhere else before with my real family. But then everything went dark, and when I woke up, I was with her." Caleb's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or custody disputes. Something much darker was going on here. When the backup unit arrived, Caleb and another officer named Greg accompanied Marcus to the address he'd given them. As they approached the house, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The neighborhood was nice enough, well-kept lawns, tidy houses, but number 42 stood out. Its windows were dark, and the front yard looked neglected with weeds growing through cracks in the driveway. Greg rang the doorbell, and after a moment a woman answered. She was tall and thin, with sharp features and cold blue eyes. Her blonde hair was tied back in a tight bun, and she wore a plain gray sweater that made her look even paler than she already was. This had to be Patricia. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped and formal. "We're looking for Marcus," Caleb said, gesturing to the boy standing behind him. "He says he lives here." Patricia's gaze flicked to Marcus, and for a split second, Caleb thought he saw a flash of anger in her eyes, but just as quickly her expression smoothed out and she smiled thinly. "Of course he does, he's my son. Is there a problem, officers?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Caleb replied. "Mind if we come in and ask a few questions?" Patricia hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in. The inside of the house was eerily clean, almost too clean. Everything was spotless, like no one actually lived there. There were no family photos on the walls, no toys scattered around, nothing to suggest a child even resided in the home. "Where's your room, Marcus?" Caleb asked softly. The boy pointed upstairs. "Second door on the left." Caleb exchanged a glance with Greg before heading up. When he opened the door to Marcus's room, he froze. The space was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. But what really caught his attention were the strange symbols carved into the walls. They looked ancient, intricate, and completely out of place in a child's bedroom. On the desk sat several books, their covers worn and faded. Caleb picked one up and flipped through it. The pages were filled with diagrams and notes written in Latin. "What is all this?" Greg muttered, looking over Caleb's shoulder. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, his unease growing by the second, "but I don't like it." Downstairs, Patricia remained eerily calm, insisting that Marcus had been acting out lately due to stress at school. But when Caleb mentioned the symbols in the boy's room, her demeanor shifted ever so slightly. Her jaw tightened, and her voice grew colder. "They're just decorations," she said dismissively. "Marcus has always been imaginative. I encourage his creativity." Before Caleb could press further, Marcus tugged on his sleeve. "There's more," he whispered urgently. "In the basement." Caleb turned back to Patricia. "Mind if we take a look?" Her smile faltered, and for the first time, Caleb saw genuine fear in her eyes. "The basement is private," she snapped. "I don't see how it's relevant to whatever nonsense Marcus is spouting." "It's relevant because he says it is," Caleb shot back. "Now are you going to let us in, or do we need a warrant?" Patricia clenched her fists but eventually led them to the basement door. As Caleb descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and a faint metallic smell filled his nostrils. When he reached the bottom, he wished he hadn't. The room was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Rows of jars lined the shelves, each containing what appeared to be preserved organs floating in murky liquid. In the center of the space stood an altar-like table covered in candles, and more of those strange symbols. It looked like the setup for some kind of ritual. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. And as he turned to leave, Patricia began muttering under her breath, reciting words in a language he didn't recognize. Shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. "Get Marcus out of here!" Caleb shouted, grabbing the boy and rushing toward the stairs. By the time they reached the top, Patricia had collapsed to the ground, unconscious. But Caleb knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. After the chaos at 42 Elm Street, Officer Caleb Hayes and his team quickly secured Patricia, who remained unconscious on the basement floor. The scene was unlike anything Caleb had ever encountered in his years as a police officer. The jars filled with strange objects, the eerie symbols carved into the walls, and the altar-like table all pointed to something far beyond what he was trained to handle. But one thing was clear: Marcus wasn't safe here. Caleb ushered Marcus outside, away from the house and its suffocating atmosphere. The boy clung to him like a lifeline, his small body trembling despite the warm summer air. "It's okay now," Caleb said softly, kneeling down to meet Marcus's gaze. "You're out of there. We're going to make sure you stay safe." Marcus nodded weakly but didn't speak. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he expected something, or someone, to come after him. Caleb couldn't blame him. Whatever had been happening in that house had clearly left deep scars. Back at the station, things moved quickly. Patricia was taken to the hospital under police custody, while investigators began combing through her home for evidence. Caleb stayed close to Marcus, who refused to leave his side. Social services were contacted and arrangements were made to place Marcus in temporary foster care until more permanent plans could be decided. But Caleb knew the boy needed answers before he could even begin to heal. "Marcus," Caleb said, gently, sitting beside him in an empty interview room. "I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me more about Patricia. What kind of things did she do to you?" Marcus hugged his knees to his chest, staring at the floor. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. She would lock me in my room sometimes for days. She said it was punishment for being bad, but I didn't do anything wrong. He paused, swallowing hard. And then she started doing those weird things, chanting, lighting candles. She'd talk to people who weren't there. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows moving when no one was in the room. Caleb listened intently, his stomach twisting with every word. "Did she hurt you?" he asked carefully. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "Not exactly. It wasn't like hitting or anything. It was scarier, like she wanted something from me, something inside me." He shuddered, wrapping his arms tighter around himself. "One time I woke up in the middle of the night and she was standing over me with a knife. She cut my arm, not deep but enough to make it bleed, and she caught the blood in a bowl. I don't know why. She wouldn't tell me." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. Rituals, chanting, bloodletting. It all sounded like something out of a horror movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was real life, and a child had been living through it. While Caleb tried to piece together Marcus's story, other officers worked tirelessly to uncover more about Patricia. What they found shocked everyone involved. Records showed that Patricia had adopted several children over the years, all of whom had vanished without explanation. Each disappearance had been written off as runaway cases, but now it seemed likely that something far darker was at play. Patricia had lived in multiple towns across the state, never staying in one place for more than a few years. Neighbors described her as quiet and reserved, though some mentioned hearing strange noises coming from her homes late at night. Chanting, footsteps, and occasional screams. None of it had raised red flags at the time. But looking back, the pattern was undeniable. To get a better understanding of what they were dealing with, Caleb reached out to Dr. Laura Bennett, a professor of anthropology specializing in folklore and occult practices. Laura agreed to meet him at the station, where she reviewed photos of the basement and the books found in Marcus's room. Her expression grew increasingly grave as she flipped through the images. "This isn't just some random collection of symbols," she explained, pointing to one of the photos. "These are part of ancient rituals designed to transfer life force. Whoever performed these ceremonies was trying to steal energy from their victims to extend their own existence." Caleb stared at her, stunned. "Are you saying Patricia was using those kids to live longer?" Laura nodded solemnly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And based on what I'm seeing here, she may have been practicing forms of black magic for years. These rituals are dangerous, not just for the victims, but for the practitioner too. They attract entities that aren't human, things we can't fully comprehend." The implications hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. If Laura was right, then Patricia wasn't working alone, or at least not entirely humanly. The thought sent a wave of unease rippling through him. Meanwhile, Marcus was placed in the care of a kind foster family named the Millers. They were experienced caregivers who specialized in helping children who had endured trauma. At first, Marcus barely spoke, spending most of his time curled up in a corner of his new bedroom. But slowly he began to open up, sharing fragments of his past with Mrs. Miller during quiet moments. One evening, Caleb visited the Millers' home to check on Marcus. When he arrived, Mrs. Miller greeted him warmly and led him to the living room, where Marcus sat on the couch flipping through a picture book. He looked up when he saw Caleb and managed a small smile. "How are you holding up?" Caleb asked, sitting down beside him. Marcus shrugged. "Okay, I guess. It's nice here, but..." He trailed off, glancing toward the window. "I keep thinking about her, about Patricia. What if she finds me again?" "She won't," Caleb assured him firmly. "We've got her locked up. She can't hurt you anymore." But even as he said the words, Caleb wasn't entirely convinced. Something about this case felt unfinished, like a storm cloud lingering on the horizon. Patricia might be in custody, but the ritualistic elements of her crimes suggested forces beyond conventional law enforcement. And if Laura was correct, Those forces weren't confined to the woman herself. As the days passed, reports began trickling in from residents of Ridgewood. Animals went missing without a trace. Power flickered unpredictably in certain areas of town. People claimed to see shadowy figures lurking in the woods near Elm Street, their movements unnatural and disjointed. Some dismissed these accounts as paranoia or wild imaginations running rampant, but Caleb knew better. Something was still out there. One night, Caleb received a frantic call from Mrs. Miller. "Officer Hayes, it's Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "He's gone. I don't know how, but he's not here." Caleb's heart sank. "What do you mean he's gone? Did someone take him?" "No, nothing like that. I put him to bed an hour ago, and when I went to check on him just now, he was gone. The window in his room is wide open and there are scratches on the wall. Symbols, like the ones you told me about." Caleb grabbed his keys and raced to the Miller's house. When he arrived, he found the entire family gathered in Marcus's room, their faces pale with worry. On the wall above the bed, someone or something had scrawled the same symbols from Patricia's basement in chalk. Beneath them was a chilling message: "He belongs to us now." Caleb's mind raced. Whatever Patricia had summoned hadn't disappeared when she was arrested. It was still active, still searching for Marcus, and now it had found him. Officer Caleb Hayes stood frozen in Marcus's room, staring at the symbols scrawled on the wall. The message was clear. Whoever, or whatever, was after Marcus wasn't done yet. His heart pounded as he turned to Mrs. Miller, who looked close, to tears. "When did you last see him?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just an hour ago," she replied, clutching her hands together tightly. "He seemed fine when I tucked him in. I read him a story and then I left. I didn't hear anything unusual until I came back to check on him." Caleb nodded, forcing himself to focus. Panic wouldn't help anyone now. He pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Laura Bennett, hoping she could shed some light on what might have happened. She answered on the second ring, her tone sharp with concern when Caleb explained the situation. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Laura said without hesitation. "But listen carefully. Those symbols, they're not just markings. They're a calling card. Whatever Patricia summoned is still active, and it's targeting Marcus. You need to act fast." Caleb thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't wait for backup or waste time speculating. Every second counted if they wanted to find Marcus alive. After instructing the Millers to stay safe inside their home, Caleb stepped outside and scanned the area. The woods behind. The house loomed dark and silent under the moonlight, their shadows stretching like claws across the ground. Something about the forest drew his attention, a faint rustling sound, barely audible over the crickets chirping nearby. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the trees, his hand resting instinctively on the holster of his gun. As he moved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. His breath fogged in front of him despite the warm summer night, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It wasn't long before he found the first clue: a single sneaker lying in the dirt, its laces torn loose. Caleb recognized it immediately. It belonged to Marcus. Nearby, he spotted drag marks leading further into the forest. Whoever had taken Marcus hadn't been subtle about it. Caleb followed the trail cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, vanishing whenever he turned to look directly at them. It felt like the forest itself was alive, watching him. After several minutes of walking, Caleb stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold: an abandoned church. Its crumbling stone walls were covered in ivy, and its windows were shattered, letting in jagged shards of moonlight. A heavy wooden door hung crookedly on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. This had to be where Marcus was being held. Before entering, Caleb called for backup, but deep down, he knew he couldn't wait for reinforcements. Time was running out. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. his flashlight illuminating the dusty interior. Rows of pews lined the nave, most of them broken or overturned. At the far end of the room stood an altar eerily similar to the one in Patricia's basement. Candles burned around it, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And there, standing, motionless in front of the altar, was Marcus. Caleb's heart leapt at the sight of the boy, but relief quickly turned to dread. Marcus wasn't alone. Surrounding him were shadowy figures, humanoid yet distorted, their forms shifting unnaturally. They hovered silently, their glowing red eyes fixed on Caleb as he approached. "Marcus!" Caleb called out, his voice echoing through the empty church. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his face blank, as though he were trapped in a trance. Caleb took another step forward, and the shadows reacted instantly, surging toward him with unnatural speed. He raised his flashlight, swinging it like a weapon, but the creatures dissolved into smoke before retreating back into the darkness. Laura arrived moments later, bursting through the doors with a bag slung over her shoulder. "Caleb!" she shouted, rushing to his side. "We don't have much time." "What do we do?" Caleb demanded, glancing nervously at the shadows circling them. "We disrupt the ritual," Laura explained, pulling items from her bag. She handed Caleb a small pouch filled with salt. "Sprinkle this around the altar. Break the symbols carved into the floor. That should weaken whatever's holding Marcus here." Caleb nodded and moved quickly, scattering salt along the base of the altar while Laura worked on deciphering the symbols etched into the stone floor. As he worked, the shadows grew agitated, lunging at him repeatedly only to dissolve into nothingness each time. One of them managed to graze his arm, leaving behind a searing pain that felt like ice burning his skin. He gritted his teeth and kept going, determined to finish the task. Finally, Laura shouted, "Now say this word. Abigo. It means to drive away in Latin. It should banish them." Caleb hesitated, unsure if it would work. But before he could act, Marcus suddenly screamed, breaking free from his trance. He turned to face the shadows, his voice trembling but firm. "Abigo," he shouted, repeating the word Laura had taught him earlier. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled, writhing violently as if caught in an invisible storm. Then, one by one, they dissolved into thin air, leaving the church eerily quiet. Caleb rushed to Marcus, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. "You did it," Caleb murmured, relief flooding through him. "You're safe now." Marcus clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably. "I thought they'd take me forever," he whispered, between tears. "I thought I'd never see anyone again." "It's over," Caleb assured him. "You're safe. We're getting you out of here." As they made their way out of the church, Laura stayed close behind, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. The forest no longer felt as menacing as it had before, though the oppressive chill lingered. When they finally emerged onto the edge of the woods, emergency vehicles were already waiting, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Paramedics wrapped Marcus in a blanket and checked him over, assuring Caleb that he appeared unharmed aside from shock. Caleb stayed by his side, unwilling to let him out of his sight even for a moment. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. They'd saved Marcus, but at what cost? Later that night, as Caleb sat in his patrol car reviewing the events of the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Patricia remained in custody, her fate uncertain as investigators pieced together the extent of her crimes. But the entities she'd summoned, were they truly gone? Or had they simply retreated, biding their time until the next opportunity arose? Laura joined him briefly, leaning against the hood of the car. "You did good today," she said quietly. "But you know as well as I do that forces like these are never completely destroyed. They wait, they adapt, and sometimes they return." Caleb sighed, rubbing his temples. "So what do we do? Just sit around and wait for them to come back?" "No," Laura replied firmly. "We prepare. We learn, and we protect those who can't protect themselves." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've faced something most people will never understand. Don't let it break you. Use it to make sure no one else has to go through what Marcus did." As dawn broke over Ridgewood, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Caleb drove Marcus back to the Miller's home. The boy was exhausted but visibly calmer, his grip on Caleb's hand loosening slightly as they pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Miller greeted them at the door, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Marcus tightly. For now, the danger had passed. But Caleb knew the scars, both visible and invisible, would take time to heal. And somewhere deep inside, he couldn't shake the nagging fear that this wasn't the end. In the days following Marcus's rescue, life in Ridgewood began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The townspeople went about their routines, unaware of the dark events that had unfolded just beyond their doors. For most, the abandoned church and Patricia's strange activities were nothing more than rumors whispered over coffee or shared online. But for Officer Caleb Hayes, the memory of what he'd seen and fought lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Caleb spent hours at the station reviewing the evidence collected from Patricia's house and the church. Boxes of books filled, with cryptic symbols and handwritten notes sat on his desk, along with photographs of the ritualistic setups. Laura Bennett stopped by often, helping him decipher the meaning behind the symbols and explaining their significance. Her knowledge was invaluable, but even she admitted there were gaps in her understanding. "This isn't ordinary magic," Laura said one evening as they pored over a particularly intricate diagram. "These rituals are ancient, designed to manipulate forces we don't fully comprehend. Patricia may have been using them to extend her own life, but she wasn't working alone. These symbols suggest she made some kind of pact or invitation." "A pact with what?" Caleb asked, his voice low. He didn't want to believe it, but after everything he'd witnessed, denial felt impossible. "Entities," Laura replied, simply. "Beings that exist outside our reality. They feed on fear, pain, and suffering. In exchange for power or longevity, they demand sacrifices." The word sent a chill down Caleb's spine. Sacrifices. That explained the jars in Patricia's basement, the preserved organs, the blood rituals. It also explained why so many children had gone missing under her care. Each disappearance likely represented another victim offered to these entities. As Caleb pieced together Patricia's crimes, investigators worked tirelessly to build a case against her. Records showed she had adopted at least 7 children over the years, all of whom vanished without explanation. Some cases had been closed prematurely due to lack of evidence, while others were dismissed as runaways. Now authorities suspected those children had met horrifying fates at Patricia's hands. But even as justice moved forward, Caleb struggled to focus solely on the legal proceedings. His thoughts kept returning to Marcus. Though the boy was safe, now living with the Millers, Caleb couldn't help but wonder how much damage had already been done. The trauma of being taken, locked away, and used in rituals would leave scars that might never fully heal. Determined to ensure Marcus received the support he needed, Caleb arranged regular visits with a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. At first, Marcus was reluctant to open up, retreating into silence whenever difficult questions arose. Over time, however, he began sharing fragments of his past, memories of strange chants, flickering lights, and the feeling of something cold brushing against his skin in the middle of the night. One afternoon, during one of Caleb's visits to the Miller's home, Marcus surprised him by asking a question. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Caleb hesitated. He wanted to reassure the boy, to tell him everything would be okay. But lying wouldn't help. Instead, he chose honesty, tempered with hope. "I don't know if they'll try to come back," he admitted. "But I promise you this, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. You're not alone anymore." Marcus nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Meanwhile, reports of strange occurrences continued trickling in from around Ridgewood. Residents claim to see shadowy figures darting between trees late at night or hear whispers coming from empty rooms. Animals still went missing, and power outages became increasingly frequent, especially near Elm Street. While many dismissed these accounts as coincidence or overactive imaginations, Caleb knew better. Something or someone was still watching. Laura warned him not to let his guard down. Forces like these don't disappear just because the ritual was disrupted, she said during one of their meetings. They retreat, yes, but they wait for opportunities to return. And Patricia, she might not be able to perform rituals herself anymore, but her actions opened a door. Closing it won't be easy. Caleb understood the gravity of her words. Even though Patricia was locked up and awaiting trial, her influence lingered. The symbols scrawled on Marcus's wall proved that whatever she had summoned hadn't given up. It was only a matter of time before it tried again. To prepare for the possibility of another attack, Caleb began educating himself on the occult. He studied the books confiscated from Patricia's home, learning about protective charms, wards, and other methods of defense. Laura taught him simple phrases in Latin and showed him how to create salt circles, basic tools meant to repel malevolent entities. Though none of it guaranteed safety, Caleb felt better knowing he had options if the worst happened. Despite his efforts, sleep eluded him. Night after night, he lay awake, replaying the events at the church in his mind. The way the shadows had moved unnaturally, the cold grip of their touch, the look of terror on Marcus's face when he realized he was surrounded. Caleb couldn't escape the feeling that he'd barely scratched the surface of something far bigger than himself. His fears were validated one rainy evening when he received an unexpected call from Mrs. Miller. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's happening here. I don't know how to explain it, but I think they're trying to get in." Caleb's heart sank. "Who's trying to get in?" "The shadows," she whispered. "They're everywhere. Outside the windows, under the doors. I can't see them clearly, but I feel them. And Marcus, he's having nightmares again. He keeps screaming about them." "I'm on my way," Caleb said immediately, grabbing his keys and rushing out the door. When he arrived at the Millers' home, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. and Mrs. Miller stood huddled together in the living room, their faces pale with fear. Marcus sat curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket tightly around himself. His eyes were wide, darting nervously toward the windows. "They've been here since sunset," Mrs. Miller explained. "At first it was just noises, scratching, tapping. Then the light started flickering. Now—" She trailed off, gesturing toward the curtains, which billowed slightly despite the windows being closed. Caleb approached cautiously, peeling back the edge of the curtain to peer outside. The rain poured steadily, creating ripples and puddles on the ground. But beyond the water, he saw movement, shapes shifting in the darkness, too fast and fluid to belong to any natural creature. Shadows slithered across the yard, converging on the house like predators closing in on prey. "Stay inside," Caleb instructed the Millers. "Don't open any doors or windows, no matter what happens." He stepped onto the porch, gripping his flashlight tightly. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the temperature had dropped sharply despite the summer season. As he scanned the yard, the shadows seemed to pull back momentarily, retreating into the trees. But Caleb knew they weren't leaving. They were waiting. Laura arrived shortly afterward, carrying supplies in a duffel bag. "We need to reinforce the house," she said urgently. "Salt lines on every window and door. Candles lit in each room. Keep everyone together in one space. It'll make it harder for them to isolate you." Working quickly, Caleb and Laura fortified the house as best they could. They sprinkled salt along thresholds, placed candles in protective formations, and recited protective incantations in Latin. The effort seemed to calm the Millers somewhat, though Marcus remained visibly shaken. Hours passed in tense silence. The shadows pressed closer, their presence palpable even through the walls. Occasionally, faint whispers echoed through the house, low and guttural, speaking in a language no one understood. Marcus covered his ears, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down his face. "They want me," he sobbed. They won't stop until they take me. They won't take you, Caleb promised firmly, kneeling beside him. Not while I'm here. Eventually, dawn broke, bathing the house. In soft golden light, the shadows retreated, melting away like smoke in the sunlight. The oppressive energy lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Exhausted but relieved, Caleb collapsed onto the couch, his body aching from the long night. For now, the danger had passed. But as Caleb stared out the window at the quiet morning, he couldn't ignore the gnawing certainty that this battle was far from over. Whatever Patricia had unleashed wasn't done yet, and neither was he. The weeks that followed the night at the Miller's house were tense and exhausting. Officer Caleb Hayes felt like he was living in two worlds, one where life in Ridgewood carried on as usual, and another where shadows lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to strike. The line between normalcy and nightmare had blurred, leaving him constantly on edge. Patricia's trial dominated local headlines, with reporters speculating wildly about her motives and methods. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence linking her to the disappearances of multiple children, including photos of the ritualistic symbols found in her basement and the church. Experts testified about the dark practices she appeared to have engaged in, though many struggled to explain exactly what forces she might have been working with. Some dismissed it as madness. Others whispered about things better left unsaid. Through it all, Caleb kept a close eye on Marcus. The boy was adjusting to life with the Millers but still bore the weight of his experiences. Nightmares plagued him regularly, waking him in cold sweats as he relived moments from Patricia's house or the church. During the day, he often seemed distant, lost in thought, as if expecting danger to appear around every corner. Caleb visited Marcus frequently, bringing small gifts, books, puzzles, anything to distract him from the darkness that lingered in his mind. On one such visit, Marcus surprised him by asking a question Caleb hadn't anticipated. "Do you think I'll ever forget?" the boy asked softly, tracing patterns on the carpet with his finger. "Forget what?" Caleb replied, sitting down beside him. "Forget what happened. Forget her." Caleb hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think you'll ever completely forget," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean you can't move forward. You're strong, Marcus, stronger than you realize. And the more time passes, the easier it will get." Marcus nodded silently, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, but it was honest, and honesty mattered now more than ever. Meanwhile, strange occurrences continued to plague Ridgewood. People reported seeing shadowy figures darting through alleyways or standing motionless in fields before vanishing without a trace. Pets went missing, crops wilted overnight, and an unsettling feeling settled over the town like a thick fog. Even those who didn't believe in the supernatural couldn't deny that something felt wrong. Laura Bennett remained Caleb's closest ally in understanding the situation. She spent hours researching ancient texts and consulting other experts in the field of folklore and occult studies. What she discovered only deepened her concern. "These entities are persistent," she explained during one of their meetings. "They thrive on chaos and fear. Every time someone panics or doubts themselves, it gives them strength." "So how do we stop it?" Caleb asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We disrupted the ritual. We protected Marcus, but they're still here. We fight back," Laura said firmly, "not just with salt lines and chants, but by confronting the source. Patricia opened a door, a gateway, that needs to be sealed permanently. Until then, these forces will keep trying to push through." Caleb frowned. "What does sealing it involve?" "It depends on the nature of the ritual used to open it," Laura replied. "If we can find the original incantation or artifact tied to the summoning, we might be able to reverse it. But it won't be easy, and it could be dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Caleb pressed. "Think about it," Laura said grimly. "You've seen what these things can do. They're not bound by our rules or limitations. If we make a mistake, while trying to seal the gateway, we risk making things worse, not just for us, but for everyone in Ridgewood." Despite the risks, Caleb knew they didn't have a choice. Ignoring the problem wouldn't make it go away. With Laura's guidance, he began digging deeper into Patricia's past, searching for clues about the origins of her rituals. Investigators had already uncovered several journals belonging to her, filled with notes and sketches detailing her experiments with black magic. One entry stood out, a reference to an object called the obsidian key. According to the journal, the obsidian key was described as a shard of black stone etched with runes. Patricia claimed it had been gifted to her by someone known only as the Keeper, a mysterious figure who promised her power beyond imagination in exchange for loyalty. The key, she wrote, was essential for maintaining the connection to the entities she sought to control. If this thing exists, Caleb said, showing Laura the journal entry, it could be the anchor keeping the gateway open. Destroying it might sever the link. It's possible, Laura agreed, but finding it won't be easy. Objects like that tend to hide themselves when they sense danger, and if it's truly tied to the entities, retrieving it could draw their attention directly to us. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. We don't have any other leads. If this is our best shot, we have to take it. Their search led them back to Patricia's house. Though the property had been thoroughly examined after her arrest, Caleb suspected there might be hidden compartments or secret rooms missed during the initial investigation. Armed with flashlights and determination, he and Laura returned to the eerie home, stepping cautiously inside. The air felt heavier than before, charged with an unnatural energy that prickled against their skin. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, across the walls, shifting even when no light source moved. Caleb forced himself to focus, ignoring the creeping sensation of being watched. They started in the basement, examining every inch of the space where the altar had once stood. Laura spotted something odd near the base of the far wall, a series of faint scratches forming a pattern. This looks deliberate, she murmured, tracing the lines with her fingers. Help me move this shelf. Together they pushed aside, the heavy wooden shelf revealing a narrow gap behind it. Caleb shone his flashlight into the opening, illuminating a small compartment carved into the wall. Inside lay a velvet pouch, its fabric faded and worn. Heart pounding, Caleb reached for the pouch and carefully opened it. Nestled within was a jagged piece of obsidian, its surface covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly under the beam of the flashlight. The obsidian key. That's it, Laura whispered, her voice tinged with awe and apprehension. Be careful handling it. This isn't just a rock, it's a conduit. Whatever happens next, don't let it touch your bare skin. Caleb nodded, wrapping the key securely in cloth before placing it in his bag. As they turned to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted sharply. A low, guttural growl echoed through the basement, sending chills down their spines. No, we took it, Laura said urgently. We need to get out of here, now. They hurried upstairs, their footsteps echoing loudly as the house creaked and groaned around them. Shadows surged toward them, writhing unnaturally as if alive. Caleb swung his flashlight wildly, driving them back long enough to reach the front door. Once outside, they sprinted to Caleb's car, slamming the doors shut behind them. The shadows gathered in the yard, pressing against the windows like smoke, seeking entry, but they couldn't follow, not yet. Breathing heavily, Caleb gripped the steering wheel tightly. What do we do now? He asked, glancing at Laura. We destroy it, she replied simply. But not here, not anywhere near people. These things feed on destruction, and if we aren't careful, breaking the key could unleash more chaos than we're prepared for. Where then? Caleb demanded. There's an old quarry outside of town, Laura said. Remote, isolated, perfect for containing whatever happens when we smash it. Caleb nodded, starting the engine. As they drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror at Patricia's house, now swarming with shadows. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally taking steps toward ending it. But deep down he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The old quarry outside Ridgewood was as remote and desolate as Laura had described. Jagged cliffs surrounded a deep pit filled with murky water, their edges sharp and uneven. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and moss, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the perfect place to destroy the obsidian key, far from prying eyes and potential harm to innocent people. Caleb parked his car near the edge of the quarry, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He and Laura stepped out cautiously, carrying supplies they hoped would protect them during the ritual. A bag of salt, candles, protective charms, and a heavy sledgehammer rested on the ground beside them. Caleb glanced at the obsidian shard wrapped in cloth, still glowing faintly despite being concealed. "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked, his voice low but steady. "What if something goes wrong?" Laura adjusted her grip on the flashlight, illuminating the rocky terrain around them. "We've done everything we can to prepare," she said firmly. "Salt circles will keep the entities contained while we work. The incantations will weaken their connection to this world. And destroying, the key will sever that connection entirely. But what happens after?" Caleb pressed. "Will they disappear completely? Or are we just delaying the inevitable?" Laura hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know for certain," she admitted. "Forces like these aren't bound by our rules. They might retreat fully, or they might linger, waiting for another opportunity. But one thing is clear, doing nothing guarantees they'll stay. This is our best shot." Caleb nodded, steeling himself. "Let's do it." They began setting up the ritual site, creating a wide circle of salt on the ground and placing lit candles at each cardinal direction, north, south, east, and west. Inside the circle, they positioned the wrapped obsidian key, careful not to let it touch anything directly. Laura instructed Caleb to recite specific phrases in Latin, ones meant to invoke protection and banishment. His pronunciation wasn't perfect, but Laura assured him that intent mattered more than precision. As Caleb spoke the words, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up, swirling dust and debris around them. Shadows flickered at the edges of the salt circle, writhing unnaturally as if trying to breach the barrier. Low guttural whispers echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. "They're here," Laura muttered under her breath, clutching a protective charm tightly in her hand. "Stay focused. Don't break the circle." Caleb tightened his grip on the sledgehammer, his knuckles white. He waited until Laura gave the signal, then stepped into the circle and raised the hammer high above his head. With a grunt, he brought it down hard onto the wrapped obsidian shard. The impact sent a shockwave rippling outward, knocking both Caleb and Laura off their feet. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, a deafening roar erupted, shaking the ground beneath them. The shadows surged forward, breaking through the salt circle and surrounding them in a whirlwind of black smoke. Glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, staring at them with unrelenting malice. "You broke the link," a voice hissed, distorted and layered with countless others. "You dare defy us." Caleb scrambled to his feet, raising the sledgehammer defensively. "Leave us alone," he shouted, his voice trembling but defiant. "You're not welcome here." The shadows swirled faster, forming shapes that loomed over them menacingly. One of them lunged toward Marcus, who had insisted on coming along despite Caleb's protests. The boy froze, paralyzed with fear, as the shadow stretched out a claw-like hand toward him. "No!" Caleb yelled, rushing forward. He swung the sledgehammer wildly, striking the shadow with all his strength. To his astonishment, the creature recoiled, dissolving momentarily before reforming. "It's working!" Laura cried. "Keep going! Break their hold!" Summoning every ounce of courage, Caleb fought back against the shadows, swinging the hammer. Again and again, each blow weakened them slightly, forcing them to retreat further into the darkness. Laura joined in, chanting loudly in Latin and holding up her protective charm. Her words seemed to burn through the shadows, causing them to writhe and scream in agony. Finally, with one last powerful swing, Caleb shattered the remnants of the obsidian key into tiny fragments. A blinding flash of light erupted from the shards, engulfing the entire quarry in a brilliant glow. The shadows shrieked in unison, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the light consumed them. When the brightness faded, silence returned. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a calm stillness. Caleb and Laura stood panting, their bodies aching from the effort but alive. "We did it," Laura whispered, her voice filled with relief. "It's over." Caleb nodded slowly, looking around at the empty quarry. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, a fragile but undeniable hope that the nightmare was truly behind them. In the days that followed, life in Ridgewood began to return to normal. Reports of strange occurrences dwindled, and the town's residents went about their routines without incident. Patricia's trial concluded with a guilty verdict, ensuring she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Authorities continued, investigating her past, uncovering even more victims whose stories had been buried for years. Marcus, meanwhile, started to heal. With the help of therapy and the unwavering support of the Millers, he began opening up about his experiences. Though scars remained both visible and invisible, he found solace in knowing he wasn't alone. Caleb visited often, becoming a trusted figure in his life, a reminder that there were good people in the world willing to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As for Caleb, he carried the lessons of this ordeal with him. He knew the line between ordinary and extraordinary was thinner than most realized, and that some battles required courage beyond measure. But he also knew that no matter how dark things got, light could always prevail, if you were brave enough to wield it. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his small home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The events of the past weeks had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Yet amid the chaos and fear, he discovered something profound: the strength to face the unknown, no matter how terrifying it might be. And though part of him wondered if the shadows would ever return, he chose to focus on the present, the quiet beauty of an ordinary evening, the warmth of family and friends, and the knowledge that he'd made a difference. For now, that was enough.